Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started. People might filter in a little bit as we go through. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Andrea Varela, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for Rural Arizona Engagement. Here at RAISE, we focus on civic engagement, voter education, and advocacy work with the fundamental belief that empowerment equals existence. When our communities are empowered with knowledge, resources, and access, they exist in the rooms where decisions are made. My co-presenter tonight is Aris Correa. Aris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, my name is Aris Correa. I'm the Advocacy Director here at Rural Arizona Engagement, and I'm just very excited to be here. Thanks for everybody showing up here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will get started. Let me just share my screen. Again, welcome everyone. Tonight, we will be discussing voting rights past, present, and future. We hope you are able to gain some knowledge and information on voting rights, the historical context, and the laws that are being discussed today. So, as we know, the history of voting rights in the US is pretty muddy. Prior to the Civil War, the US Constitution did not provide specific protections for voting. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, that guaranteed equal protection of the law, as well as granted citizenship to all persons born in or naturalized in the United States. However, slavery and other restrictive laws led to voting to almost exclusively be practiced by white men. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, provided specifically that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Despite this amendment, discriminatory practices were used widely to prevent Black people, people of color, and women from exercising their right to vote. The extension of the right to vote to Black citizens was strongly resisted, with discriminatory laws and acts of intimidation and violence. In the 1890s and into the 20th century, white people gained control over the legislatures and amended their constitutions to reestablish white supremacy. Ratified in 1919, the 19th Amendment prohibited the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens on the basis of sex. And this is where we see women's suffrage come into play. But by 1965, concerted efforts to break the grip of disenfranchisement had been underway for some time, but had achieved only modest success overall, and in some areas had proved entirely ineffectual. Some of these discriminatory voting practices that led to the disenfranchisement of people of color, Black people, and women were things such as poll taxes, where the voter had to pay a fee to vote in a national election. There were white primaries where only white voters were allowed to vote. There were grandfather clauses that stated that those who could vote prior to 1867 and their lineal descendants would be free from educational, property, and tax requirements for voting, which really further caused disenfranchisement because it disproportionately excluded communities. There were also literacy tests, moral character tests, property ownership requirement, and the Jim Crow laws. These Jim Crow laws were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or seek other opportunities such as those. The Black codes, which were the strict state and local laws, were threatening, none to say the least. And if broken, people faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, and in a lot of instances, even death. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, voting rights activists and civil rights activists were subjected to various forms of mistreatment and violence. During this time, President Johnson issued a call for a strong voting rights law. Congress determined that existing anti-discrimination laws were not sufficient for states' enforcement of the 15th Amendment. They started hearings for what is now known as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or membership in a language minority group. Section 2 of the VRA prohibits this discrimination in any voting standard, practice, or procedure that results in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote. Later, we will look at a Supreme Court case that addressed discriminatory practices in Arizona. Among other provisions, the Act contained special enforcement provisions targeted at those areas of the country where Congress believed the potential for discrimination to be the greatest. One of these such provisions was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required that the U.S. Department of Justice pre-clear any attempt to change any voting qualification or prerequisite to voting, or standard, practice, or procedure with respect to voting in any covered jurisdiction. And these covered jurisdictions included states and localities in which a history of race discrimination in voting was present. And that's why their voting policies and procedures were subject to preclearance. I want to note here that at the time of its enactment, Arizona was a preclearance state. Under Section 5, states and localities with a history of race discrimination in voting were subject to preclearance of their voting policies and practices by the DOJ, and they had to run proposed changes in elections by the federal government and show that they weren't discriminatory before putting them into effect. There are a few things that require preclearance. Some include prerequisites to voting. So what are your voting requirements? Do you need a voting ID? Redistricting plans. So drawing of new legislative and congressional district boundaries had to be run and approved by the DOJ before being adopted by the state. The state needed to pre-clear any changes to voter qualifications, so who can register to vote, as well as any other change to a standard voting practice or procedure. Section 5 of the VRA, however, faced significant detriment in 2013 with a Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder. Shelby County in the covered jurisdiction of Alabama. So again, in this covered jurisdiction, it's a state or locality that has a history of discrimination in voting practices. So this existed in Alabama. Shelby County sued the U.S. Attorney General in the U.S. District Court, seeking a declaratory judgment that sections 4B and 5 are facially unconstitutional. In June 2013, the court did rule that the coverage formula in section 4B, which determines those localities and jurisdictions in section 5, was unconstitutional because it was based on an old formula. So while section 5 is still in place, by striking down the coverage formula in section 4B, the court effectively ended preclearance. So as a practical matter, this means that section 5 is inoperable until Congress enacts a new coverage formula. In Arizona, this is really important because we were a preclearance state. And this just means that without preclearance and without seeking preclearance from the Department of Justice and the federal government, we are open to more discriminatory laws and voting procedures because they are not being reviewed, and we are one of those jurisdictions. One really important thing to note is that voters can sue under Section 2 of the VRA, whenever minority voters have less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. We can see this in another Supreme Court case, Bronovich versus the Democratic National Committee. In this case, the DNC and groups of individual voters filed suit in federal court to prove that two policies were racially discriminatory. These two policies were the out of precinct policy, or the OOP policy, and the ballot collection ban. The OOP policy stated that any vote cast in the wrong polling place must be tossed out, even if it was for a race in which the voter could cast a ballot anywhere in the state. The ballot collection ban is a criminal statute barring anyone but a voter's family or caregiver from returning early ballots for another person. This went through the courts. The Ninth Circuit Court ruled that these policies were unconstitutional because they amounted to illegal discrimination of how it made it harder for people of color to vote given the specific circumstances in Arizona. This ruling was appealed, and the appeal is pending adjudication before the U.S. Supreme Court. A real quick breakdown of the ruling was, again, that the Ninth Circuit Court ruled both policies violated Section 2, specifically because they resulted in discrimination against Native Americans, Latinos, and Black voters. The court also held that the ballot collection ban was passed by Arizona's legislature for a discriminatory purpose, which violates both the VRA and the 15th Amendment. And the Supreme Court did hear arguments on March 2nd, 2021, and is scheduled to make a decision by this summer. With that, I am going to switch it over to Aris.
All right, some additional historical context with regards to Native Americans. In 1831, the Supreme Court declared that the tribes were domestic dependent nations whose relation to the United States resembled that of a ward to his guardian. 1868, African Americans gained the right to vote, but a majority of Native Americans were excluded from this. This is from the 14th Amendment clause that excluding Indians not taxed. Sometimes Native Americans did receive citizenship, usually in exchange for their land. And many states had cultural purity tests that prohibited Native Americans from voting unless they adopted the language and customs and habits of civilization. Native Americans also had to deal with the same types of Jim Crow laws and voting restrictions that were mentioned earlier in this presentation. Which brings us to Arizona. In 1910, before Arizona was a state, the Native American population was at about 14%, a pretty large number. And if Native Americans were allowed to vote, would be pretty powerful politically. In 1909, again, before the state was, I guess, a state, when Arizona was a territory, they had a statute that required a literacy test as a prerequisite to vote. And then here we just have a couple of examples of the Arizonan Constitution and the New Mexico Constitution and how they approached voting and the political process. In Arizona, an individual included a requirement where an individual had to be able to read, write, speak, and understand the English language sufficiently well to hold a position in public office, a requirement that's still in our Constitution today. Compare that to New Mexico's original Constitution, which protected citizens' ability to participate in the political process, free from discrimination on the account of race, language, color, inability to speak, read, or write the English or Spanish language. So that is an interesting contrast between the states there. Arizona continues to deny the Native American right to vote. In 1924, the United States passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which declared Native Americans citizens within the US and also within their state. Even with this Act, Arizona continued to deny Native Americans the right to vote until 1940. And Arizona continued to use literacy tests to block the vote of Native Americans until 1972, which is not very long ago. And at this time, 80 to 90% of Native Americans were could not read English, or English could have been their second language. And so that brings us to kind of where we are right now with regards to our voting rights laws. In 2004, Prop 200 requires that Arizonans provide identification at the polls when they want to vote. There had been a provision that required voters to provide documentation of their US citizenship in order to register to vote. The Supreme Court had struck that down specifically for federal races, but allows that to stand for the state races. If you go to the Secretary of State's website, you can see that there's an option to register to vote with the Arizonan form or the federal form. This law continues to negatively affect the Native American and persons of color populations, or poor folks who are less likely to have their birth certificates, Arizona IDs, utility bills that they can use, or tribal identifications with photos. To vote in Arizona elections, you have to be a US citizen, be a resident of both the state of Arizona and of the county that you're listed in, and be 18 years or older before the next general election. Back to proof of citizenship. This is a lot of information here. This is also on the Secretary of State's website, but real quick, you need to prove that you're a citizen, an Arizona driver's license issued after October 1st, 1996. And if you don't have that, you can do this with a birth certificate that verifies citizenship, along with supporting documentation in case you got married and changed your name, a passport, presentation of your naturalization documents or your alien registration number can be filled in on box 11 of the VR form. You can also provide your Indian census number, Bureau of Indian Affairs card number, tribal treaty card number, or fill in your tribal enrollment number on box 10 of the VR form. You can also provide a legible photocopy of your tribal certificate or Indian blood or tribal or Bureau of Indian Affairs affidavit of birth. So those are all the documents in Arizona. You cannot register to vote in Arizona if you have been convicted of a felony and have not had your rights restored, or if you have been adjudicated as incapacitated by a court of law. Which brings us to the other aspect of voting in Arizona, the documentation that's required at the polls. Again, in Arizona, you need an Arizona driver's license or a valid non-operating ID card after October 1996, a tribal enrollment card or other form of tribal identification. For this situation, ideally with a photo. You also need or you could use a valid United States, federal, state, or local government issued identification. Again, this is from the Secretary of State's website, some information about other forms of ID that you can provide at the polls, which include utility bills within 90 days of the election, a bank statement, Arizona vehicle registration, Indian census card, property tax statement, tribal enrollment card, vehicle insurance card, a recorder certificate, anything from the mail to you that's just has official election material listed on it, or a voter identification card provided by the county recorder. So the next option for voters here in Arizona is utilizing the permanent early voting list, or PEVL. PEVL is very popular here in Arizona. Over 80% of Arizonans utilize the PEVL. It's very convenient. If you sign up for the PEVL, you are permanently on the list, and you will receive your early ballot via mail for every election you're allowed to vote in. You could ask to be removed from the PEVL if you like, of course. Right now, a voter can be removed from the Pebble if the county recorder receives that ballot as undeliverable. So let's say they mail you a ballot, you happen to move, the ballot gets returned. But the county recorder can only do this after they've taken some necessary steps to contact the voter at their new address. With regards to voter registration and the Pebble, proof of citizenship has already been provided, right? We did that during the voter registration process. So when you get your ballot in the mail, all you have to do is sign affirming who you are and then mail your ballot in. So that's the process for the Pebble right now. Currently, early ballots can be mailed out 27 days before an election and can be received by the county recorder's office by 7 p.m. on election day. So that is the structure of the Pebble right now. So that is kind of where we're at with regards to how voting works in Arizona. So next will be what's our possible future. So we'll talk about some bills that we think are harmful to voting in Arizona. The first is, and these are current bills that are currently going on and being discussed and being held in committees right now and being voted on by your representatives in Arizona right now. The first one is SB 1485. I call this the Pebble Purge Bill. This bill will remove voters from the permanent early voting list if voters do not vote early for 2 election cycles. Meaning also if you vote in person, if you get your ballot, but you decide, you know what, I want to vote in person and do that for 2 election cycles, you will also be kicked off the list. This bill will remove 100,000 persons from the list and effectively takes the permanent out of the permanent early voting list. We think this bill is not good. I think it's obviously Arizonans like using the Pebble. I think it's a benefit for people to be able to receive their ballot in the mail. Sometimes people don't vote on every election. Sometimes that is their vote. They say, you know what, I don't want to vote for anybody. Nobody is doing what I want them to do. That's a choice that people can make. But a few years down the road, you decide that you want to make a vote. Your ballot comes in, you're able to fill it out, sign it, and send it off. And we think that's important. So we're actively messaging against legislation like this. So we want to bring that to everybody's attention there. The next bill I want to talk about is SB 1713. This bill has changed a little bit over the past couple weeks. This bill had required a driver's license number or photocopies of bills or bank statements to be provided every time someone were to mail in their ballot. Again, some of that language that's changed and now requires your driver's license number or voter registration card number, which would be mailed out to you. Again, for the permanent early voting list, this documentation has already been provided to the state. So this is just additional hoops and hurdles that the state wants to impose on the Arizona voters. Again, for a little bit of context, the Navajo Nation spans nearly 16,000 square miles and has just 11 post offices. And compare that to Scottsdale, which has 12 post offices. So more of these early mail requirements further complicate an already difficult to use early mail system for Native Americans. And again, many Native Americans don't have a driver's license. And because of this difficult postal service situation, it's questionable whether someone would receive their voter registration number or even their ballot on time. Another thing to remember is that a lot of people on the reservation don't have traditional addresses. And because of that, a lot of times mail has to be sent to a post office. And because of the limited post offices on the reservation, these can be very far from people. It could take over 100 miles to travel to a post office and back for someone to get their mail. So that's definitely a concern. adding additional requirements on the early voting situation, we think is not helpful. Further complicating the situation, another bill that's being debated by our politicians at the state is SB 1593. This bill would further limit the window for early voting from 27 days to 22 days and would require the ballot to be postmarked by Thursday before the election, possibly shaving off more days from this time frame. Navajo Nation members using certified class mail could send out a ballot, and it could take 10 days to get to the county recorder's office, 20 days round trip for the whole process. So further limiting our use of the pebble or how long we have to be able to vote early will greatly impact the ability for Native Americans to utilize the pebble. So this is also concerning and something we definitely want to advocate against. Another bill that I want to highlight is SB 1106. Another bill that further tries to remove people off the permanent early voting list. This is a bill which would eliminate the requirement of county recorders to take the necessary steps to contact a voter at their new residence whenever their ballot is returned as undeliverable. In this case, in this situation, voters would be automatically taken off the registration list. I think there's concerns if something happens with the mail or there's some kind of confusion, people can be automatically taken off the list without the county recorder reaching out and trying to figure out if someone lives at that residence. It also creates a Class 5 felony for persons to forward mail to students or ballot mail. So this includes family members. So we think this is very strange. Students sometimes don't live at home, but they live nearby, let's say ASU or something, and they're able to keep their voter registration back home. There's nothing wrong with that. Students are able to do that. Obviously, other people have primary and secondary residencies. So we think this bill is bad and kind of strange, and it's weird that they would try to create this felony for sending a ballot to a student. So we are very outspoken against that. We feel that it's limiting young people's ability to vote in an unnecessary manner. And then a couple other really quick bills to talk about. We have the ballot measure process here in Arizona. We've had it for over 100 years. This is the ability for Arizonans to pass laws on their own without the need or the use of the Arizona legislature. Currently, right now, a ballot measure initiative requires 50% plus one to have an initiative become law. The people in the state legislature want to change that and make that 55%. They also want to change the rules with regards to the single subject rule, meaning that a judge can throw out a ballot on a technicality if they feel that the ballot measure is not dealing with a quote unquote single subject. For example, a ballot measure allocating tobacco tax funds to help fund childhood education could be considered something that's not a single subject. So this is further limiting Arizona's ability to pass laws on their own. And so we think that this is not good for Arizonans and further limits Arizonans' ability to make legislative decisions for themselves. So that was a lot of negative bills. We wanted to highlight them because we want people to know that these bills are being discussed and in committee and moving forward and will be voted on. It's a process that's going on right now. And I think it's important that people have the information. You can go to the Arizona Ledge website and look up these bills for yourself. And you can even see who's voting for these bills. If these bills are things that you think are bad or bad for the community, bad for people voicing their concerns and issues to their leaders, you can look up which politicians are voting for these measures. And I think it'd be good for people to do that. So all those negative bills that we want to fight against are important for us to pay attention. But also, what about hopefully a future that we want, a beautiful future? Just a couple ideas based on what some other states are doing. Voting rights in other states. For no ID is required to vote in 13 states. So just a little bit of information there with regards to that. Also, with regards to photo ID, before the 2006 elections, no state required a photo ID to vote. So this is a very recent trend that's happening. 12 states have automatic voter registration. 9 states have same day registration. 2 states after a felony conviction allow those people to still vote, so they never lose their right to vote, even if they had a felony conviction. And 29 states allow people with felony convictions to vote automatically once their sentence or probation is completed. So these are maybe some examples of things that Arizona could do to make voting more accessible for more people, which we think is important. And a couple other things that are going on. These 2 items here are with regards to federal bills that are being debated. We have HR 1 and HR 4. HR 1 for the People Act would require states to establish an automatic voting registration system, would guarantee voters same-day registration, would require states to have at least 15 days of early voting for federal elections, and would require states with voter ID laws to allow people to vote without identification if they complete a sworn statement telling us who they are, and would require states to inform persons with felony convictions that after they serve their time, they can vote. And HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, would re-establish pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The pre-clearance requirement is the states with a record of racial discrimination and voter suppression would have to submit those changes in their election procedures for approval in advance before any of those changes could be made, and would require pre-clearance nationally for practices that disproportionately affect communities of color. For example, reducing access based on language and reducing polling locations in diverse areas. And I believe that's all I have for me. Let me hand it off to Drea.
So, what can we do to fight for our rights? We have discussed the history of voting rights, what laws are being discussed now, what laws have been passed in the past, and what can we do to fight for our rights? Well, the most important thing is that we must hold our leaders accountable. As Aris mentioned, these bills are being discussed in committee and being voted on very soon. Um, it's so important for you to know how your representatives are voting and your senators are voting on these bills and how they feel, because they are going to affect the voting rights of Arizonans across the state. So we encourage you to contact your representatives if you don't like these bills that really do challenge our voting rights. We also encourage you to submit letters to the editor and volunteer for organizations fighting for voting rights. One such organization is our sister org, Rural Arizona Action. We are part of they are part of a legislative accountability team, and they are looking for volunteers. And I just want to mention here that this PowerPoint, along with the resources and links discussed, will be sent out after the event. So you will have all of this information for yourself as well. but I just wanted to show you what our volunteer form looks like. So if you click on the link that we will provide, it just takes you to our sister organization's volunteer page. You just fill out some basic contact information, and someone will get back to you. There are so many ways to get involved. There's calling, text banks, postcard writing, canvassing and lit drops, and networking, which means getting your friends involved and your networks involved. And also, while we are discussing voting rights tonight, there are so many topics and issues that are of the utmost importance and that we really care about. And so we also work with partner organizations that are doing similar legislative accountability work, such as our sister organization. And we will send out information for that as well. Some of these orgs are doing text banks, phone banks, but they all are reaching out to constituents about bills and encouraging them to talk to their representatives and hold the legislature accountable. So with that, I wanted to end the presentation with asking if there are any questions.
I just wanted to highlight really quick, I think it was Janelle. Another way to make your voice part of the record is to sign up for the request to speak system, where you can, I believe you can comment and also thumbs up, thumb down legislation. So that's super important, super awesome that you're signed up for that. And then you can testify at committees when those are being discussed. Right now, I think most of them, well, I think most of them have people be part of those committees via like a Zoom call. So there's a process for that. You have to sign up a couple of days ahead of time, send an email. But it's also very important that people pay attention to what's happening with those bills, where they are at the process, and when they can hopefully request to speak. And you know, our organization will sometimes talk at those meetings, or at those would provide testimony. And so that's good, you know, for me or somebody else to present. But it's also really, really impactful when we have other people from the community also speak at those committees. So it's very important that people sign up to do that. So thanks for pointing that out, Janelle.
And
I have a question, if I may.
of course.
This is Pete Rios. I have a question for Mr. Correa in respect to the federal legislation. John Lewis is, they call it, but it's election reform. But at the end of the day, if we're going to put states back under pre-clearance, the only way that it can happen in the Senate is with doing away with the filibuster that requires 60 votes. If that rule is changed, where it only requires a simple majority, 51, it can be done. The problem is we have our senior US Senator from Arizona that refuses to do away with the filibuster rule. And I guess my question to Mr. Correa is, are we as this organization and as members of other organizations focusing any request at our senior US Senator to please consider doing away with the filibuster rule in the US Senate so we can move vitally important legislation forward? Because as long as that filibuster rule is in play, the Republicans still control. So I was just curious, are we as organizations doing anything to focus attention on that?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I think you know, the filibuster issue is very concerning. You know, for our organization here, Rural Arizona Engagement, you know, we do try to focus on specifically the issues with regards to voting. And obviously the filibuster situation is an issue that's impeding that. You know, we do have a sister organization that does focus on that, and there are And we do have, there's also other organizations that are really focused on voicing those concerns and kind of doing the grassroots work to make that concern heard to our senators. So that is the thing that's going on, because we think the issue of voting rights is very important. With, you know, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, the issue is what is the concern for us. So I guess the answer is yes. There are organizations that are amplifying that concern. Thank you very much for the question.
And I
Cassie?
know it's a sticky question, but I wanted to ask it because I wanted others that are listening in to be aware of that. Even if we, as the organization that you all represent, can't really do a lot with it, but I think people, voters need to know what's going on, because at the end of the day, if we don't do away with the filibuster rule, a lot of good legislation is going to go down the drain. And that's simply all that I'm trying to address. And I thank you, both of you, for the work that you're doing. I think it's fantastic. So keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate you bringing up that issue. It's very important. And obviously, you know, for me personally, I think voting rights is very important. Again, you know, our organization is about engagement, about empowering people. And so that's what we're pushing for. And sometimes there's bad laws that are being passed, and we want to fight against those because we don't think they help the community. So thank you very much for that question.
Okay, gracias.
Gracias. Are there any other questions?
This is Helen Hunter. I have a quick question. Can you tell me what is being done or what groups are working to try to engage the Native American community to make voting more accessible for that population?
I guess I can try to answer that. So, you know, our organization tries to reach out to that community, but also there's a larger organization that works with the Intertribal Council and kind of does that work within Arizona. So there is active engagement there. And then we try to assist in that situation as much as we can through that other organization. So yeah, we're trying to do that work as well. Thank you. Anything else?
And just really quick, Addis, I wanted to say again, we work on it with a table. And so we have, you know, specific working groups working with specific communities. So we have hands in the entire state that work with different populations. Thank you for that question.
So if someone wants to volunteer, can they indicate on your form what population or what particular area they'd like to work in, other than what you have listed? I didn't see anything about what particular outreach or engagement a person would like to can choose.
Sure, yeah, we can add that to the volunteer form. That could be very helpful. So we'll make sure to add more to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, with that, I would like to thank everyone so much again for taking the time to join us tonight. I know we're all zoomed out after a year, but these are topics that Raise feels really strongly about and wants to engage as a community with. So thank you for all of your questions, your participation, and your patience. And we hope to see you again at our next event. Hope you got everything you needed, and we will see you next time.
We really appreciate you guys coming out.